What I'm just going to do is explain to everybody who's just joining the call. Thank you for joining us this afternoon on our National Day. You're very, very welcome. We're just going to wait a minute or two for everybody to get on the call, because it's only 15:58 and we're due to start at 4 p.m. on the dot. We have the Minister for 45 minutes, give or take, is it? Yep. And then what we will do is I'm going to ask the Minister a couple of questions, and then if you have questions yourself, please put them in the chat. We'll take a break at about the 20-minute mark to catch up on some of the questions if they've come in, and then we'll finish out, and then we'll have more questions at the end. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them onto the chat. We will get to them. But obviously, if you could keep your microphones muted and your cameras off so that we can keep the focus on the three of us, that would be great. So we're just about 30 seconds to go. Everybody ready?
Good to go.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our St. Patrick's Day event for the Ireland-Portugal Business Network. We are in the fourth event of our sustainability conference this week, and I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Ambassador Ralph Victory, who is the Ambassador of Ireland to Portugal, and Minister of State for Financial Services, Insurance and Credit Unions, Minister Seán Fleming, who is joining us from Dublin this afternoon. The theme of the call is going to be financial services and insurance, obviously, as that is the Minister's brief. And I am going to hand over now for the welcome by Ambassador Ralph Victory. Ralph.
Thank you very much indeed, Aoife, and good afternoon, everybody. Banachty na lá féile pádraig, Díobh Galéir, a very happy St. Patrick's Day, Feliz Dia de San Patricio to you and to all IPBN members, Ireland-Portugal Business Network members here in Portugal and in Ireland, and possibly further afield. Aoife, as you say, we're absolutely thrilled and honoured to be joined this afternoon by Minister Fleming, who, if I'm not mistaken, Minister, I don't think you're in Dublin, rather you're at home in your Laois Offaly constituency. Correct. So we very much appreciate you joining us from home, where indeed it is a public holiday in Ireland, but nevertheless, I'm sure still a working day for you and other members of the government and elected representatives. Minister, of course, you've been first elected to Dáil in the Irish Parliament in 1997. A chartered accountant by background, you were, of course, previously Chairperson of the Dáil Public Accounts Committee and Chairperson of the Oireachtas Finance Committee prior to taking up your current role as Minister. I will obviously be leaving it to Aoife to discuss the issues of the day with you, but we're sincerely very grateful to you, Minister, for joining us this week as part of the series of events that the network has organised. Aoife and her fellow board members throughout this week got off to a very successful start with two sessions yesterday, another very good session this morning with your party colleague MEP Barry Andrews, and we're really looking forward to the session today. If I may just very briefly pay tribute to Aoife and everybody involved on the IPBN side for what has been obviously a very challenging year, but certainly I think throughout they've had a lot of activities, a lot of online events, always to a very high standard. And I'm sure absolutely today's will be absolutely continuing in that vein. So, Minister, as I say, once again, Céad Míle Fáilte, Míle Buíochas, you're most welcome, and many thanks for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand over to Aoife. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. So everybody, just a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll get to them very shortly. But I'm going to start by asking you, Minister, if you could tell us a little bit about your role and your political career to date, but particularly what the role for financial services, insurance and credit unions involves, please.
Okay, first of all, thanks for the invitation today. And I would have liked to be in Lisbon today. We've actually good weather here in Ireland. It's a glorious day for St. Patrick's Day. And we'd like to be there. Now, I will have to say, I've been in Portugal a few times as one of holiday makers. There's very little footpaths in Albufeira and Portimao and Laois. I haven't walked many a time and stayed in beautiful hotels and accommodation. But I've been to Lisbon a number of times. And you might spot the painting on the wall behind me is a piece of artwork I picked up in Fortaleza in Brazil. And rolled it up and brought it back and framed it as here in my constituency office. So that's a scene from Brazil. But obviously, a number of the times I've been out there, I would have stopped over in Lisbon on the way out and on the way back just to get an extra day or two out of the trip. So I'm quite familiar with you, and I'm envious of your fine weather. We're just about coming into good weather here now. So just in relation to myself, I think Ambassador gave a very straightforward outline of my political career to date. I am a chartered accountant. I did chair the Dáil Public Accounts Committee in the last number of years in the term of the last government. I would have chaired the Finance Committee prior to that. So I chaired a couple of committees in the Dáil, and I was our party spokesperson on Public Expenditure Reform as well for a period also. So a lot of my background is into finance. So maybe it's no coincidence I landed in the Department of Finance as Minister of State, the Taoiseach. We have the formation of the government is a bit different than normal. It's three-party government, so there's 6 Fianna Fáil, 6 Fine Gael, and 3 Green members of the cabinet, and the ministers of state are broken down along similar proportions as well. So Minister Donoghue is a senior minister in the Department of Finance, and I'm the Minister of State. So I've been given responsibility for Financial Services Centre, now mainly the International Financial Services Centre, not dealing with the domestic banks, AIB and Bank of Ireland, because the Minister himself is a major shareholder in those banks and in Permanent TSB. So he would have direct responsibility in that area as being the shareholder on behalf of the taxpayer. But in relation to the financial services, it's primarily the international financial services sector in Ireland. I've delegated responsibility in relation to credit unions also and insurance. So I have 3 bows to work on. But in addition to that, it goes without saying, in a busy department, you know, I get drawn into everything else in the department as well, especially with Minister Donoghue, who's chair of the Euro Group at the moment, is taking quite a lot of his time, and I understand that. And so I do have to fill in for him quite a bit, you know, domestically as well. So, and I'm delighted to have that opportunity. So the 3 areas I deal with: financial services. I think most people know it implies about 50,000 people in Ireland, and they've been very resilient during COVID. Most of the work has been able to be done remotely. Interestingly, in Ireland, I make the point that came very obvious to me early on in the job last autumn. Working from home in a number of the financial services companies actually means working back in your home country, not necessarily in Ireland. It's not down in Portlaoise or Cork or wherever. And that has been it's an issue that people are conscious of, because if people are outside the state for extended periods, it can have implications in relation to where they're resident for tax purposes, for employment law, and ultimately maybe corporation tax. So there's an extra twist in people who are not, you know, permanently living here, working from home, and that's an issue we're conscious of. Be that as it may, the financial services sector, a bit like the pharmaceutical sector and the IT sector, employment remained at a very high level all along. Taxes were high, payroll taxes, VAT and corporation taxes were very high, and it helped the government finance some of the COVID payments that had to be made during the last year and continuing into this year. I will say the changing face of the financial services sector in Ireland is now more an IT industry. I've met with a couple of major companies that employ up to 2,000 people in Ireland, and some of them would have over 50 and 60 different nationalities working for them in Dublin. So very international. And a lot of these people, and we all know from payments and dealing with your banks, it's not a question of just going into the bank counter like people did in general. It's all technology. So really, most of their employees actually are working in the technology sector. And that does change the face of it a little bit from the traditional manner. Credit unions in Ireland are, there's 200 credit unions all over Ireland. There's special responsibility for them as well. They've been a great source of savings and people able to get loans, short-term loans and credit over all the years. Their task now, like everybody else, is profitability, because they have large deposits, but interest rates are in the negative at the moment. So that's their particular immediate difficulty. And then finally, the area I work in and spend a lot of my time on as well is insurance, because it's a big issue over the last number of years, the cost of insurance and availability for insurance. Because Ireland has, I suppose, a checkered history when it comes to insurance. We've only one Irish insurance company standing. All insurance companies other than that one company are written by European, UK, or American insurance companies. So we are very much a part of the European and international insurance market. obviously the regulation is carried out by our own central bank and they're regulated here. But the issue is they're not domestic controlled companies, and they obviously keep a careful eye in relation to the cost of claims. Just last week, we had, very significant issue because the cost of claims in Ireland, we are told, they're out of sync with the cost of claims for injury and personal injury and whiplash claims, and people get a pain in their back or their neck after a car accident or something like that, have been out of sync with the UK and the rest of Europe. And the Judicial Council, which means all 166 judges in the country, reviewed them and made significant reductions, and that will be having legal effect literally in the coming weeks. But that might help, that will help the cost of insurance. And the last thing I'd say about insurance as well is, because there's so few companies in the Irish market, there's a lack of competition. My task is trying to increase the competition, because sometimes if there's only one major insurance company insuring a particular area of Irish business, it makes it very, very difficult, and especially if there's a bad claims history. We did have a situation over 2 years ago where some of the playground and childcare centres had high claims and there's only one company willing to quote, but that has been resolved since then. So it's a difficult balancing exercise, but my overriding market or position on all of this is I want to get value for money for the Irish people, whether it's car, house, home or business insurance, and to have a stable insurance market. So that's a quick run through the issues I have to deal with in my direct area of responsibility in the Department of Finance.
Great. Well, we're going to look at the insurance issue, particularly from the perspective of sustainability later. But in the first instance, we're going to talk about the financial services, and there is a lot being mentioned at the moment about sustainability and sustainable financial services. Could you give us an idea of what approach the government is taking to sustain, what they mean first and foremost, or what they're taking it to mean about sustainable financial services, and what direction they see it going in?
Okay, the first thing I think we all know is financial services is a very big area. One of the biggest aspects of that is a lot of people have money in pension funds, and they need long-term stability in relation to their pension fund that will be there when they come to retire in 30 or 40 years and continue to pay a reasonable pension. So sustainability means for the long haul. Now, recently it's also coming to mean in that it's looking at environmental and social considerations as well, not just a quick book approach that some people might think investments are all about. Secondly, a lot of major companies have substantial funds to invest as well. So when we talk about sustainable financial products, really what we're talking about, I think everybody knows there's going to be a major increase within the EU especially, and obviously we hope worldwide, but we can only talk about what happens in the EU to reduce our CO2 emissions. And that is going to require major investment in projects for sustainable development into the future. That's going to require substantial funds. And we want to encourage more people into investment in that area rather than a traditional area of just building office blocks, roads or hospitals or ferry ports or whatever the case may be. So really, we want more investment in the environmental area. That means sustainable development and social considerations to be taken into account, not legislation on ethical investment, but obviously people want, when they're investing in a fund, that fund is invested in a socially responsible manner, and that there's, I suppose, the working conditions of the people who produce the products that are financed by that are decent, and that's very important. And then we also look at the governance issue as well in this area. That means that there is proper governance in place, and that's where the central bank has a role. The last point I would say on that is the EU is looking at that closely, and they are going to require all major investments by registered funds in the EU, including in Ireland, to look at the environmental, social and governance issues of every investment that they take from now on. Doesn't mean they have to go down that road, but it must be on the checklist that they actually examine. They can't disregard this and just automatically ignore it. So we're getting a big help from Europe, and really sustainable is about sustaining the planet, and that requires investment, and we want to encourage people to invest in that area.
Well, I'm going to leave the issue of governance aside at the moment. I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience on that aspect of it. But you know, if we're looking at the drivers of sustainability, and obviously finance is one of those things, what way do you see that planning out in Ireland, for example? You know, how are you going to manage it in Ireland?
Well, how it's managed in Ireland is quite straightforward. It will be part of our national commitments in relation to sustainable development and reducing CO2 emissions. We have a target in this government for an average reduction of 7% per annum, and that means approximately 50% over a decade. None of that can be done without investment. So we are saying as a government, major areas for investment is going to be in the sustainable energy area into the future. And obviously, if that's where the government policy is going, that's where the legislation sets targets, and that's where the government will be investing substantial amount of government funding in many of the projects I've just mentioned, but much of the funding will have to come from the private sector as well. So if that's the main show in town, I would say, I think that the money will follow where the investment is. So we're geared up for that. We're promoting that. We introduced legislation just before Christmas, a particular financial model called a limited partnership, which might be in other countries already, a couple of EU countries, but not too many. And that's an area that people can make a limited investment as a partner without being on hook for, you know, your house being on hook for itself. So that's an area that people will have to look at, this area of investment when they're considering investment. So really, the government will be taking the lead with legislation, with government investment, and we believe the rest will follow.
Okay. Brexit has been a bit of a nightmare for Ireland, but you know, in financial services, they weren't included as part of the TCA. So what opportunity does that present to Irish Indigenous companies and indeed companies from around the rest of Europe in taking over or filling the gap that may have been created as a result of Brexit?
Okay, the first thing I'm going to say to Brexit, and I'm a realist and a practical person when it comes to these issues. I generally, for Ireland, and I think generally at EU level, the problems caused by Brexit weren't as bad as we expected. That's the first thing I have to say. Everyone expected disaster. Yes, we had some difficulty. Yes, there are still a lot of issues to be ironed out. But if you turn the clock back, you know, you think in the term of the last government in Ireland, the issue of Brexit coming down the track was the biggest single issue facing the Irish economy over that period. And that's why my party supported Fine Gael in government at that stage. Fianna Fáil supported them with a confidence and supply agreement to help keep a government in place to plan for Brexit. That was the extent of the difficulties we anticipated. Now, there was a plus side to all of that. That meant a lot of Irish businesses started to get ready. I would believe of all the countries in the EU, and certainly much, much more than Britain, we were far more Brexit ready than most other countries that were going to be impacted on it. That's because I suppose we felt we were going to be the most impacted because the volume of trade with the UK and the closeness of the two countries and the amount of people who move forwards and backwards. Now, notwithstanding all that, of course there were difficulties when we hit the 1st of January. Of course there were holdups, you know, at the ports. Of course, the COVID actually ended up being as big a difficulty in practical terms when we hit January, not just the Brexit, as in people had to get testing, all the truck drivers had to get testing. But there's two problems. Was there custom documents in order? And secondly, was the driver safe to travel to the next country? So we had two problems hitting us almost at the same time. So I actually think we've managed the Brexit fairly well. I'd say 80% of it was well planned. A lot of the difficulties we've had in Ireland as a result of Brexit, customs and customs clear, is because Britain wasn't as well prepared as we were. And they are playing catch up at this stage. And of course, it wasn't covered in the TCA agreement. This area of financial services and issues like customs and all that comes into that area. And I think a lot of the difficulties we had weren't just on the Irish side. Yes, our revenue commissioners had difficulties with the volume of trade. Yes, small traders had difficulty who weren't regular users of the customs process. The bigger companies, by and large, I think there was no stage when there was no, I don't ever believe there was a day when the amount of goods going into, leaving the country or coming in, over 75% went through with no hold up whatever. Yes, 25% or 20% was held up, and yes, that's what led to the backlog. So I do believe that we were a bit more Brexit ready than I think people might have expected. So from that point of view, there's a number of issues that will still come up. And I actually take Brexit as an opportunity for Ireland. The main reason I say that is we're now the only English-speaking country in the EU, which we all know. That's a positive in terms of foreign direct investment into Ireland, especially from America, our biggest source of foreign direct investment. And then secondly, we're now the only country in the EU that uses the common law system, which would be the old English system, but that applied right across the Commonwealth historically. So there are a large number of countries in the world who are more familiar with our legal system than maybe the French or the German or Italian legal system. And that is a stepping stone for us. However, we will miss having the UK in there as well, because when it came to issues like legal processes, you know, they did the heavy lifting on all of those matters because they had the strength of numbers and they had the City of London with more resources. So to some extent, we're on our own now on that one. But I actually believe it's going to be a particular advantage. And I think when we look back on this year, you know, down the road, we'll be talking about COVID, not about Brexit.
Yeah, so even though you think that, you know, we haven't really covered it off as the way I wanted it, is the opportunities presented by all of the capital leaving London and moving into markets such as Amsterdam and Dublin, in fact, as well. Has that presented opportunities for businesses in Ireland in Fintech, for example, or other services related to financial services?
Absolutely. And I'm probably, for the two reasons I mentioned already, the closeness of our relationship with the UK, many businesses and some of the major financial institutions in the UK found it an easier step to go to Dublin because they understood the language, they understood the legal system, and the travel was much easier. So Ireland has benefited quite a lot from that, and we're actually continuing to benefit, I think, as the year moves on. There's a number of major companies in the UK continue want to do business in the EU, and they have to get authorization from the central bank now within the EU, and that's where a number of applications are with our central bank. And some countries are adopting a position, or some companies are adopting a position that will work through one central bank in the EU, so they'll be able to carry out all their activity. Some of the other major companies I've spoken to even this year already are saying Europe is so big, they might actually get their authorization from the Irish Central Bank for, we call it Western Europe, and maybe one of the Eastern European countries to have a parallel authorization from a central bank in Eastern Europe, maybe to look after the other half of Europe. So it has resulted in a lot of extra employment. It has resulted in a lot of extra business. And I actually believe we can continue to grow that.
Great. And as you know, the new European Green Deal is also another opportunity, and the RFF and also Euronext Dublin Stock Exchange is now the hub for green bonds. What kind of opportunity do they present? Under, obviously the European stuff is under the government umbrella initially. So what opportunities do they present to Indigenous Irish companies for innovation and R&D?
Well, what I will say is, and I'm back, because we're in the EU, I think the EU's leadership will be very important in progressing the sustainable finance agenda. And I think I've made that clear. These will be EU we'll have our national targets, but it's all part of the global targets and the Paris Summit, and it's also now got to do with the European targets that will be set as well. Now, some of these targets can be set and they can be a little bit fluid, and I think everybody knows, to use the phrase now, the direction of travel. We mightn't have exact dates, we mightn't have exact targets, we mightn't have specific, but everybody knows the direction of travel. So the European Green Deal and Renewal Sustainable Finance Strategy will help Ireland, I think, post-COVID. I don't think it's going to help us a lot in the immediate couple of months, But I think when we get out of COVID and there is substantial investment, it is going to be a help at that stage, but not just yet. And I say because of COVID, and that's the principal reason. But I will say the designation of Euronext Dublin as a hub for green bonds and other ESG bonds in November of 19 was an example of Ireland's important role in this area. And the one thing I will say is, even despite all that, and Euronext, the Irish stock exchanges, you know, some people have asked me, what's Euronext? I call it, it's the stock exchange. It's just the new name, and as part of the European group of stock exchanges, because some people are not sure what it is. Just in case there is somebody on the call, just they can get the title of what we were talking about. But we still actually have a very close relationship during, it's not a transition period, but just during an extended period with the UK Stock Exchange in London, because all share dealings that are done through Euronext in Dublin, the settlement and the payment arrangements are carried out by the London Stock Exchange. That is historically the way it was. So as we speak, even today, people mightn't appreciate this, but all share transactions and the stamp duties payable in respect to those transactions are actually being settled in London, even, you know, today as we speak. And then the London Stock Exchange remits that back to Ireland. Now that will be moving to Belgium after a short period, because we need to be able to have that settlement arrangement for transactions on our Euronext Dublin within the EU. But that's an example of where, even though, you know, the Brexit has occurred, we'll call it case-by-case arrangements have been put in place to smooth the transition to when we will eventually do that through Belgium rather than through London into the future. But all in all, I do think the European Green Deal, the investment plan, you know, is part of everything we've been talking about the last few minutes. I think Ireland is positioning itself very strong. We've given commitments to put legal targets into our legislation, you know, up to 2030 and ultimately 2050. That's a long way off. But those targets, I think, will show that Ireland might be ahead of the curve relative to other EU countries when it comes to dealing with some of those issues.
I like your ambition. We had Barry on this morning telling us that we were way behind on some of this stuff. So it's nice to think.
And I accept that. And, you know, it's a bit like COVID. You know, I have people in Ireland saying, you know, we're way behind everyone else, and why aren't we getting them from somewhere else? And, you know, the vaccines, and you look at the country they're referring to, and they have less percentage of the population vaccinated compared to ourselves. So I wear the optimistic hat. Okay.
I just want to check and pause for 1 second. Is there anybody there with questions that they'd like to ask the Minister about financial services, the Green Financial Services Centre, any of those before we move on towards insurance? Is there any questions, Arnold?
Yeah, Aoife, there is just one question from John. He's asking, has the insurance regulator a role in advising planning authorities and others on the environmental risk in new projects? For instance, construction projects in localities which could be subject to future flooding or other hazards due to environmental change.
Well, I think maybe what we'll do is ask the question for the Minister that I was going to ask, and that will probably bring it in, Minister, if that's okay, because obviously we were going to say, you know, it's great for many businesses to have top level plans to do everything, but climate change, we know, is having a catastrophic effect on businesses in terms of on the ground, they're getting destroyed, they're getting flooded. You know, wildfires, not necessarily prevalent in Ireland, although I've seen my share on Howth Head. These things are becoming more and more prevalent. And, you know, is there any concerted approach to managing insurance costs in the face of galloping climate change, which is, you know, let's face it, going to get a little bit worse before it gets better?
Okay, the straight answer is no.
No.
Okay, but let me elaborate. You know, a lot of people would say, of course, it's an important issue, but I think we haven't come to that stage of our discussions yet. It's clearly an issue that is being raised, but it'd be totally premature for me to give a positive response to that at this stage, because my approach is the insurance market generally across the EU, even though a lot of the countries are European group orientated. The legislation is quite different in every country. We haven't got any discussions yet significantly in relation to that issue. However, the only small point I will make is that in relation to climate change into the future, every other country, and we know if it's not dealt with, it will have catastrophic effects if countries don't plan and put mitigation measures in place. The only experience we have of that in Ireland to date, in my view, would be the issue in relation to flooding. And I think that's common across a number of EU countries. And the issue of insurance for flooding, I would call major flooding events a catastrophe. It might be, a geographical issue. It mightn't affect all the country it doesn't affect all the country at any one time, but it can affect substantial amounts. And the difficulties with issues like flooding is they can reoccur. And so there are going to be a lot of issues. And I think these won't be solved in a generation. We do have to look at some of the properties, and I look at Ireland and other EU countries are very much the same. A lot of the cities, the big cities, are located on the coast, near where the oceans are and where the rivers come into the sea, into the ports. So we have fluvial flooding as well as flooding from the sea as well. And some of those properties, no matter what we do, are going to experience flooding intermittently into the future. So the biggest mitigation measure we can take, and I don't know if the planning authorities fully got there yet, is in relation to planning on the flooding side, is to allow no development into floodplains, full stop. Now, everyone talks about a 1 in 100-year risk. We've all seen examples of locations that have flooded 3 times in a decade, and we're told there was only one chance that it would occur in 100 years. So I don't believe the information we've got so far, this issue about a 1 in 100-year risk. I think if you're talking about that, you can be unlucky and get it 3 times in 20 years as well. So I do think really we have to plan to avoid some of the catastrophes that we know of. And I think you go back over the centuries, we planned all our many of our urban areas, around water. And that water now is causing a problem with flooding, and it's going to get worse. And we know we won't talk about the polar ice caps, but we can actually see the percentage of the planet underwater into the future will be a little bit higher than it was 1,000 years ago. And I think the planning for some of those issues will be long-term. We haven't cracked it yet in Ireland. We've put in a lot of mitigation measures for flooding, temporary, permanent, but still Mother Nature is stronger than anything any man can do. So I'm saying, some catastrophes are issues that we can't fully solve just yet. And I think the insurance issue is a significant issue, but the bigger issues are trying to avoid the catastrophes rather than to insure our way out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think small businesses in particular are very, very concerned about this issue. And, it's one of these things to say, is it just going to be there an issue until it becomes a catastrophe and then it has to be dealt with? Or do you think some actual planning will go into improving the insurance situation, particularly for small business? Not such an issue for large business, but for small businesses, it could be.
What I am saying is, if you're in an area that has flooded a number of times, no amount of short-term planning will change that. Full stop. Planning won't stop the floods happening. And that's why I say the ultimate solution is a generational issue by making sure businesses into the future are not in areas that are potentially liable to flood. Doesn't solve the problem here and now. I'm actually in the next week, before the month is out, I'm having a meeting with the Office of Public Works in Ireland, specifically and solely on the issue of insurance in relation to the flooding issue. So it's very much a live issue, but I am putting my hands up. I don't know the solution. Some people have proffered a solution that there should be a levy on all insurance flooding issues so that there's a fund there. A bit like, I give you the parallel. If there's an uninsured driver on the road, we all pay an extra 30 or 40 euro for our car insurance in Ireland to cover the fact that there's 7% of people on the road haven't adequate insurance. And if they do crash, whoever is the victim of that crash has to be compensated. So essentially the insured businesses, some people are suggesting they should we may be forced to pay a little bit more to cover those who haven't insurance. I'm given no commitment on that. That's the suggestion. That's one suggestion that has been made to help the small businesses, and I know it has traction. But you know, it's a very, very big issue. Those discussions are actually commencing before the month is out, with the Office of Public Works, who are the people responsible for all the flooding mitigation measures, and they have the floodplains mapped, and they know the difficulties, and we're having our first meeting on that literally before the end of this month.
Okay.
But a long way to go, I'll stress that. I think we could be here in a decade having the same conversation.
Yeah, well, I suppose just as an observation and as a previous small business owner, or well, I still own a small business, but it is one of these things that people are genuinely not, they don't know what to expect. The government doesn't know what to expect, but the insurance agencies seem to have all of the cards in their hands and are able to say, as we saw with the COVID, you know, business interruption, that they're able to say, actually, no, we're not paying because this wasn't covered or that wasn't covered, which makes running businesses extremely stressful for people. And it's just a case of seeing whether the insurance industry will ever be a little bit collared to be able to not get out of those things.
Okay, and Aoife, I think the example I gave is a replica. It's a bit like the uninsured drivers on the road. There's a percentage of people there in your situation, some small business that can't get insured for flooding through no fault of their own, but there are uninsured drivers who haven't insured through their own fault. They just haven't wanted to pay the money, right? But it does result in the fact that there is a percentage of people uninsured for the particular risk if they hit somebody, and who picks up the tab is the question. And you know, I know what happens when it comes to motor insurance. I'm not suggesting that will happen in relation to flooding, but I'm under pressure to consider that matter. So I ain't giving any commitment to that one anyway soon, because it's a very, very big ask, and you know, there's a lot of work would have to go into that before that could be trashed out in detail. But that suggestion is on the table.
Great. Well, we are coming down to the last 10 minutes. So if people have questions, please send them in to Arnold, and Arnold, you can let me know if there's questions here. My last question then is, you know, with the increasing rate of digitalization of financial services, it's a great opportunity for growth and development, but it also increases raising the risk of fraud. So what measures will be introduced, do you think? And they will probably be up, because I know that there is quite a significant input from Europe on financial, you know, cross-border fraud. What do you think is going to come in, and how do we avoid the inevitable confusion between what consumers know is happening and what big corporations are trying to do?
Okay, that's an age-old question. Somebody trying to make money and somebody else having to pay. The first thing I am going to say is, in relation to the financial services sector in particular, as I've already indicated, is now moving to what I call the Fintech area, or the digital finance area. And I think the digital side, or the technology side, is now becoming more significant than, we'll call it, the financial side of the business. I've given you an example of, you know, and I can easily say this, I met with MasterCard just the other day, and they employ almost 2,000 people in Ireland. And I know half the world probably have a MasterCard of some description, and they would be very big in processing a lot of financial transactions. And having listened to them for half an hour, I realized I was talking to a technology company completely, rather than a financial company, because everything they did was based on technology. So I'm saying it's here already. That's the first thing I'm saying. And I think you recognize that. And we all probably know most of the getting money from financial institutions illegally into the future won't be a guy with a mask and a balaclava. It'll be a clever guy in a laptop in some obscure country where it's hard to track him down. And we know that. The second thing I do have to say, though, in this area is we do need to encourage new entrants into the area. We do need new financial products. The old financial system of the banks and the branches and people going into the counter to lodge money, you know, I think I can say this again, Revolut are not long in business, and they have 1.3 million customers in Ireland alone in that short period. So a lot of people have just moved on, and they see that as a card that's giving them access to payment and to cash. Now, there's no loans or borrowings attached to it, but it's an example of a good high-tech product is now moving very much into the financial area. One positive element of the technology was that during COVID, the limit on these cards, the contactless payment, was moved from 30 to 50, and that was only made possible through technology. And and I think we all know when you're in a shop and there's a queue of people and they were keying in PIN numbers and this sort of thing, and you're in a hurry to move on, and there was 10 in front of you, that caused a problem. So technology, whether we like it or not, is part of the future, and we need new business coming in to push the established financial institutions into a more consumer-friendly issue. The one point we do have to really consider here is those who are digitally excluded, and there's digital poverty in certain parts of the world, in certain parts of the country, and in particular age groups in particular. So that's my biggest worry about the technology, is those who are going to be excluded. That's my first priority. And I think that's something we do have to work around. But I'm just saying, the Commission did adopt a digital finance package and a new Fintech plan, I think, last year. Work is going on that. And we do embrace the move to digital finance, but definitely that is going to be the priority. And the regulators, the individual regulators,
have we just lost the Minister?
are the people who have the hand on. They're the police. The central bank will probably mean the central bank will have to spend more on technology to police the technology that you and I have just been talking about. So I'm in favor of the technology. It brings big risks, but it brings fantastic benefits as well. And it's going to put the onus on the regulator. And like many of these, our central bank is under the ECB. So really the ECB will have a big role here as well. So it'll be interesting between the Commission and the ECB. They're two different institutions. The Commission will have a view, but actually, in my view, as the ECB and the domestic central banks are going to be the people who will be policing this at the end of the day. Of course, there can be fraud and there'll be criminal activities, but the first line of defence, in my view, will be the central bank.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that the resources will be made available to any organisations, such as consumer protection organisations, as well, to help understand this digitalisation more? Okay, well, you touched on 2 points. The first thing I'd say is the regulation the central bank will be levied fully on the financial institutions. Like, that's the model we're going to here in Ireland. Not sure about other EU countries, where the full cost of regulation will be borne by the regulated entity. So the more technical they are and the more difficult they are to regulate, the greater the cost will be to the regulator, and the regulated entity will have to pay that. The taxpayer, it's not for the taxpayer to come in and subsidise global technology companies if they want to operate in Ireland. If you want to operate in Ireland, regulated by the central bank, you pay for the right to come in, and you pay for whatever regulation is required. So back to the point you mentioned about consumers, that actually goes to the point I was talking about, those who are digitally excluded. I think we're in the same area. One, of course, some won't have access, some will have access, but to know their rights. So data protection will come in quite a bit here. And I think you're raising a point that hasn't been fully dealt with yet, is I think the consumer protection associate groups, even government bodies, aren't probably as strongly resourced as they need to be in this area. I'm not criticising our CPCC, Consumer Protection and Competition Commission, but from my discussions, they have a long road to travel, and that does require government resources. Mm-hmm. Do you think they'll be made available? Well, the answer is I don't know. I'd love to say yes, but look, what I will say is, I think that the first line will be through the central bank, and the regulated entities will have to pay for all the regulation that's required. I just put it simply: if the regulator feels there is a need and warns the government there's an issue here, we're doing our regulation, but you have to look after consumer protection, I think that will certainly be taken on board. It is happening. There was a time the consumer protection in the financial services area in Ireland was under the remit of the central bank. Literally, they had the pillar to look after the customers,
and also a separate pillar looking after the regulated entity. And I think people felt there might have been a conflict there, and that has been given to the Consumer and Competition Authority now, or Commission as they call them now. And I think they have to be adequately resourced because they're not under the umbrella of the central bank, like they used to be. You know?
Great. Well, that's coming to the end of our 45 minutes, Minister. Thank you very much for your answers. I have a couple of questions coming in. Arnold, can you start at the beginning there? There's a couple of questions that we'd like to put to the Minister.
Yeah. So one is about with the BOI announcing the closure of 80 branches throughout Ireland. Is the financial sector doing enough to help urban and rural sustainability? And if not, what can they do?
Okay, just simply on that, my nearest 3 branches in my immediate area are part of those closures, so I know firsthand what it means. Secondly, what I will say is they have closed, as you say, about 80 branches, and that means that's to happen by September, in about 6 months, by which time they have committed during that period to have arrangements with the local post office. There's none of those locations where there's a branch that there's not a post office within nearly 200 meters of the actual branch. So small business, I'm talking about the retailers, shops who want to do lodgements and lodge checks and collect cash, you know, when they need extra cash flow at different times of the week, you know, for their tills and whatever. That all, those level of activity will be able to be done through the post office. Now, things like negotiating loans you won't do over the post office counter, I think, too easily. But then secondly, I've already met with the 2 major bodies plus one other one that represent the credit unions. And I've asked the credit unions to see how they can step into the breach, because they're in all of those towns. I know none of the towns, there might be some, but I'm not aware of any where there isn't an existing credit union branch where the Bank of Ireland is moving out. And I think there's an opportunity here for the credit unions, but they're local, they know the local business, they know the local community, they have a friendly face, people trust them. So I'm hoping the combination of what the post office can do and what the credit union can do will help. But that all said, I think if you listen to the conversation we've had in the last 40 minutes, we know financial services are moving through the technology method. It's important to that there'll be an ATM branch left in every one of these towns. Some of them already have 3 or 4, and there'll be no problem people getting cash, but there's 3 of them don't have an ATM in 3 of the towns, and the bank have given a commitment to ensure that they will locate an ATM on a permanent basis in those towns. But the other thing we are going to say is, I think most people know that they would normally go into a local bank branch maybe twice a year. So it's not something that was being done on a daily basis. And some of those transactions, you know, can be done online. Yes, it's the loss of services. I'm as much worried about the impact of that on other local businesses and another big empty building on towns that have already been suffering already. They're the kind of issues we're looking at, that it doesn't bring about further degeneration in some of the towns. Because why are they pulling out of some of these towns? They may not be the most prosperous towns, and we don't want to make that situation worse. So that's kind of where we're at. The government can't do anything. It's a commercial decision by Bank of Ireland, the same it was by NatWest to close Ulster Bank. And, you know, the government will ensure in every way it can through the post office network that reasonable arrangements will be put in place, but it will disadvantage some people.
Great. Arnold, is there any other questions?
Yeah, just one more question. It's about the regulation. Regulation are always playing catch up, even more so now. So what strategies are in place?
Okay, well, 2 things I'll say on that. I think people understand that they're not just playing catch up, they're slow, even when they do know what they're supposed to be doing. And without touching on it, we've seen the recent Davy situation. For the life of me, I don't understand why it took so long to get to the bottom of that. So definitely, not only are they playing catch up, but they can be slow about their process as well. And I don't think they're short of staff. I just don't know why things take so long. So that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. But they do need some more legislation as well, you know, to follow individuals who make the mistakes. Up to now, the emphasis was the financial institution that caused the problem, whether it was a banking or some other financial institution, insurance or stockbroker, but not so much the individual. And that legislation is coming in. It's in the programme for government signed up to last summer, and that legislation will come in and it will strengthen the hand of the regulators, and that's it. It's very funny you should say that. Normally when I speak to the financial institutions, they complain about over-regulation, and when you talk to the public, they say they're not regulated half enough. So I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, is that I think if they're more responsive and speedy, it would be, I think, everybody's best interest. It would increase confidence in the regulations being enforced by the central bank. And that's really one element I would like to see, them being quicker off the mark when they actually start on a particular project. But again, I will say the major financial institutions in Ireland, like Bank of Ireland and AIB, they are regulated by the European Central Bank. Our central bank in Ireland is just the local agent of the ECB. And ultimately, banks above a certain size at EU level are regulated by the ECB, not domestically. We're just a local agent carrying out the work for the ECB when it comes to the major financial institutions.
On which note, I think we're going to come to a close. Ambassador, would you like to say any final words?
Thank you very much, Aoife. And yes, Minister, if I may just extend sincere thanks to you. That was a very useful session, getting lots of perspectives on the various issues being raised. And certainly your brief is a very broad one. So we sincerely wish you all the very best with all your ongoing work. And just to come back to the point about your previous visits to Portugal, hopefully we'd be delighted if you were able to join us at some point in person, hopefully here out in Portugal, when the time is right, when conditions allow. We'd very much look forward to that, and I think that is something hopefully we might aim to arrange over the period ahead if we possibly can. Aoife, sincere thanks to you as well, and to all IPBN members for particularly those who have joined this evening. If I may just give a very final shout out before allowing the last word to you and the Minister, just give a very quick shout out for anybody who's available to join us later on this evening. We'll be having a special event at 6:30 to mark St. Patrick's Day, the Embassy's virtual St. Patrick's Day 2021 reception. So if you go to ireland.ie/Portugal, you'll be able to find everything there, and things will get going from 6:30 onwards. But many thanks indeed from the Embassy side. Once again, Minister, thank you indeed for your participation this afternoon. Very much appreciated, and hope you get to enjoy the rest of your St. Patrick's Day back home. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Minister,
take care.
Thank you.